The courtroom was silent, filled with palpable tension. That day, something seemed different, as if the air itself was holding its breath. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, a solemn echo, as the judge, Marian DuPont, headed towards her seat. Every movement of her hands, every adjustment of her black dress, demonstrated unfailing concentration. When she entered the room, her gaze, determined but calm, swept over the entire assembly as if trying to understand the weight of each soul present. The outside world seemed suspended, the air heavy with expectation, as if this moment would mark a turning point. Journalists stood at the gallery, their presence discreet but omnipresent. Their pens were ready to capture every word, every gesture. The cameras, like eager eyes, stood ready to capture the slightest movement. Below, the families of the plaintiffs and defendants sat in a strange stillness. Their gazes were fixed in front of them, frozen by anxiety, by fear of the unknown, by the need to understand what was going to happen. But it was on the dock that Marianne's attention was fixed, as if the answer to all this tension was there, in the look of this man. There, Julien LeBlanc, a young police officer, was waiting. He was nervous, almost invisible in his own skin, his face marked with guilt, uncertainty, a man on the verge of losing everything. Across from him, Adam Thomas, a young black man, observed the scene with an intensity that spoke of years of suffering and resilience. His gaze was that of a man who had experienced the unjustifiable, that of a man who knew that justice had not always been on his side, but who, today, carried within him a glimmer of hope. That day, he had this strange certainty that the truth would ultimately triumph. The injustice he had suffered would no longer be a weight to bear alone. Hope, fragile but present, was in his eyes, a hope that day, justice would finally be on his side. Marianne stood up, breaking the heavy silence of the room, and struck her gavel with a precision that seemed to underline the importance of the moment. Is the jury ready to render its verdict? The room immediately fell silent, and even more palpable tension enveloped the assembly. A murmur of anticipation passed through the room, almost imperceptible, but enough to thrill those who were impatiently awaiting this decisive moment. The president of the jury, a middle-aged woman with a face marked by years of reflection, slowly stood up. With a sheet in hand, she advanced towards the judge, her step measured but heavy with meaning. "Your Honor," she said in a calm but trembling voice, each syllable marked by the gravity of what she was about to announce, "we have reached a verdict." His words echoed through the room like a death knell. Every ear was strained, every heart beat harder. Eyes turned between the jury, the defendants and their lawyers, as if the truth was hanging in the air, ready to reveal itself. "Please read it." Marianne's voice, firm, was the echo of a respected and feared authority. The long-awaited moment had arrived. The jury had decided. Julien LeBlanc was found guilty of false arrest and racial discrimination. The words echoed through the room, heavy and irrevocable, and a collective gasp escaped from the crowd, a sigh that seemed to mix relief and apprehension. Adam stood there, motionless, his gaze fixed on the scene, absorbing every word, every nuance of this moment. Then, slowly, a smile of relief lit up his face, a smile almost imperceptible, but powerful. It was justice, finally, but it was not the end. It was a small step, a small sliver of truth in a world still filled with darkness. There was still a long way to go, but this verdict was a symbol, a victory against the invisible forces that too often govern the daily lives of the oppressed. Julien was a frozen shadow in the room. He wasn't moving, barely breathing. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, distant and absent, as if he was trying to escape the gaze of those around him. His hands were clenched on the table in front of him, the fingers white from the pressure. When he finally stood up, his trembling legs seemed incapable of supporting the weight of shame. His voice, broken, slipped into the heavy silence of the room. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said, each word carrying the weight of the guilt he now wore like a second skin. "I thought I was protecting the community, but I was wrong. I let my prejudices guide my actions, And I am sorry. His eyes searched for some form of redemption, but he knew that apologies wouldn't be enough to repair what had been broken. The silence invades the room, heavy with meaning. Eyes were fixed on him, some full of anger, others of incomprehension, but all carrying a raw truth. Julian's words, as sincere as they seemed, could not erase years of suffering, of injustice and discrimination. Marianne, the judge, felt her heart sink as she listened to this confession. She understood. She knew the apology was sincere, but she also knew that the pain so many people had endured was not a simple scratch that a word could heal. "Your excuses are heard, Julian," she replied, her voice soft but firm, full of the wisdom of a woman who had seen too many times the fragility of humans in the face of their own errors. "But it's too easy to hide behind excuses. The harm you've caused runs deep, and it affects lives. Words alone aren't enough to repair what's broken." Julian looked down, his head heavy with guilt. He could no longer face the looks of others. He knew that he had failed, that he had betrayed not only his vocation but also the trust that society had placed in him. He was now alone, confronted with the immensity of his error, his blindness. The truth had come out, but it would not erase the pain that would continue to ripple through the lives he had touched. The room emptied slowly, the murmurs of the assembly dissipating into the corridor, but Marianne stood there, her eyes glued to the verdict, thinking about what it meant, what it implied. It was just one case among many, a small glimmer in an ocean of injustice. A ray of light in a dark sea, but also a reminder that the fight for justice, for fairness, was never over. This verdict did not mark the end of the road. He was a symbol of hope, a message that the truth could still triumph, even in the darkest times. But it was only a step. There remained so much to do, so much pain to repair, so many prejudices to combat. The world had changed, maybe just a little, but it was a start. And, despite everything, this beginning was enough for the light to continue to pierce the darkness. Moments later, as the room slowly emptied, another police officer, Samuel, approached her. His face, marked by the traces of many battles and inner struggles, told a story of difficult experiences, but his eyes shone with a glimmer of hope. He was not like Julian, a prisoner of his errors, but a man in search of redemption. "Marianne," he said softly, his voice laced with touching sincerity, "thank you for doing the right thing. This is just the beginning, but we must continue to fight." Marianne nodded, a sigh escaping her lips. His gaze wandered around the empty room for a moment, the sound of chairs and the murmurs of the crowd slowly fading. "It's a step, Samuel, but it's not enough. There's still so much work to do." She stood up, ready to leave, her thoughts swirling around the many injustices she had observed over the years. Today's verdict, although symbolic, would not instantly change a system that was built on such fragile foundations. She had done what she felt was right, but she knew there was still a long way to go. Before she left the room, one last figure came forward. It was Adam. He moved forward calmly, as if each step was calculated, but Marianne saw the glimmer of recognition in his eyes, a glint that spoke volumes about everything he had been through. He stopped a short distance from her, a slight smile playing on his lips, but it was not a smile of simple politeness. It was a smile full of meaning, a smile of gratitude, relief, and hope. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice carrying the emotion he hadn't been able to express before. "This trial wasn't just for me, it was for everyone who suffers this injustice. You gave me a voice." Marianne felt her heart tighten upon hearing his words. She had heard those words many times throughout her career, but something in the way Adam said them resonated a deeper truth. She looked at him, looking beyond words, finally understanding the full weight of what he had just said. "I was just doing my job, Adam," she replied, her voice soft but full of the gravity of the years of struggle she had experienced. "But I hope this marks a beginning, not an end." He then smiled, a smile full of understanding and hope. "It's a start, and it's all we need. Thank you." His words were simple, but they carried hope for change, no matter how small. A change that, in his mind, marked the beginning of something bigger. As Adam left, Marion stood alone in the empty room for a moment, observing the table on which the evidence and trial documents were placed. The verdict had certainly been rendered, but for her, the fight continued. That day, a small victory had been won, but she knew it was just a drop in the ocean. The entire system needed much more. More courage was needed, more voices, more acts of rebellion against injustice. However, despite the heaviness of the road still to be covered, a little light had just entered a world too often plunged into shadow. A fragile ray, but enough to illuminate the road. Marion breathed deeply, her thoughts floating between the hope that Adam's words instilled in her and the stark reality of the obstacles to come. Maybe this victory was small, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a little more optimistic. A battle was won, but the war continued.